The airport buzzed with its usual flurry of activity, a microcosm of humanity moving in orchestrated chaos. Passengers shuffled from gate to gate, their rolling luggage echoing faintly against the polished floors, blending with muffled announcements and occasional laughter. Flight attendants strode confidently in neatly pressed uniforms, their calm professionalism contrasting with the harried energy of travelers. Amid this sea of movement, Vanessa Carter stood out not because she wanted to, but because her presence was impossible to ignore. She exuded a quiet authority, the kind that didn't require words or flamboyant gestures. Dressed simply yet impeccably in tailored slacks and a silk blouse, she carried herself with the poise of someone who had nothing to prove. Vanessa had spent years building her reputation as one of the sharpest business minds in the industry, rising from humble beginnings to owning one of the largest airlines in the country. But today, she wasn't here to bask in her success or draw attention to her position. Instead, she'd chosen to fly anonymously on a routine commercial flight, a decision born out of her belief in personally understanding her company's operations. She wanted to experience what her passengers endured, both the good and the bad, without the filter of VIP treatment. It was her way of staying grounded in a world that often sought to elevate her above the struggles of everyday life. Her decision to fly under the radar, however, was not without its challenges. People often made assumptions based on appearance, and Vanessa had grown accustomed to the subtle and sometimes overt biases she faced. She knew the looks, the quiet, fleeting glances that lingered just a moment too long, the raised eyebrows of disbelief when she entered spaces where others thought she didn't belong. It was an old story, one she had learned to navigate with grace and unshakable confidence. As she approached the boarding gate, she noticed the captain and first officer standing nearby, chatting casually. Captain Stephen Walsh, a man in his early 50s with a weathered face and an air of self-importance, leaned against the counter. His voice carried over the din of the terminal, filled with the kind of bluster that came from decades of unchecked authority. Walsh was a relic of another era, a time when pilots were seen as untouchable heroes. While his skills as a pilot were undeniable, his attitude left much to be desired. He was known for his disdain for change, particularly the kind that threatened his perception of superiority. Walsh's eyes flickered toward Vanessa as she handed her boarding pass to the gate agent. There was a moment of hesitation, a narrowing of his gaze, as if he were mentally categorizing her. She noticed it but gave no reaction, her expression calm and unreadable. It was a look she had seen countless times before, a fleeting judgment that she had long stopped taking personally. But for Walsh it wasn't fleeting. Something about her unsettled him, not in a way he could articulate, but enough to trigger a quiet irritation. He leaned closer to the first officer and muttered something, his lips curling into a smirk. The younger pilot chuckled uneasily, unsure whether to laugh or deflect. Vanessa, without so much as a glance in their direction, walked past them and onto the plane. Inside the cabin, Vanessa was greeted by a flight attendant who guided her to her seat in first class. She nodded politely, thanking the attendant before settling in. The seat was comfortable, the atmosphere pleasant, but Vanessa's sharp eyes took in every detail: the cleanliness of the cabin, the demeanor of the staff, the subtle wear and tear that hinted at corners being cut. This wasn't just a flight for her, it was an audit, a chance to understand her company not through reports and metrics, but through experience. She opened her tablet, glancing over some notes for the upcoming meeting that awaited her at her destination. But her focus was interrupted when she caught movement out of the corner of her eye. Walsh entered the plane, his presence immediately commanding attention. He paused at the front of the cabin, his eyes scanning the rows of passengers, as if sizing them up. When his gaze landed on Vanessa, it lingered for a moment too long. She could feel the weight of his scrutiny, even though she didn't look up from her tablet. Walsh muttered something to a nearby flight attendant, who nodded and hurried off. The exchange was brief but enough to pique Vanessa's curiosity. She wasn't here to make waves, but she also wasn't one to ignore subtle provocations. For now, she let it go, focusing instead on her work. As the boarding process continued, Walsh found reasons to linger near the front of the cabin. Whether it was a need to assert his presence or a subconscious reaction to Vanessa's unassuming confidence, he seemed unable to fully ignore her. When the final boarding call was announced, he finally retreated to the cockpit, but not before glancing back one last time. Vanessa noticed, her expression unchanged, though inwardly she couldn't help but feel the familiar stirrings of annoyance. It was always the same, a quiet reminder that for some, her presence was a challenge to their worldview. The plane taxied onto the runway as Walsh's voice crackled over the intercom, his tone polished and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're expecting a smooth flight today, with a flight time of approximately 3 hours. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the journey." It was standard fare, but something about his delivery felt forced, as though he were compensating for an earlier slip in composure. Vanessa listened without reaction, her mind already shifting to the tasks ahead. For her, this was just another flight, an opportunity to learn, to observe, and perhaps to make changes where necessary. But for Walsh, it was the beginning of something far more personal. He couldn't shake the feeling that her presence disrupted the carefully constructed hierarchy he had come to rely on. It wasn't just her demeanor or the ease with which she carried herself. It was something deeper, something that challenged his sense of place and authority. And while he couldn't yet articulate what it was, he knew one thing for certain: this flight would not go as smoothly as he had announced. As the plane reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign dimmed, the cabin settled into a calm rhythm. The hum of the engines filled the air, accompanied by the occasional clink of glasses as flight attendants served drinks to the passengers in first class. Vanessa sat quietly, flipping through a document on her tablet, but her peripheral awareness caught every movement around her. She wasn't just a passenger, she was an observer, her mind noting each interaction, every expression, and the overall atmosphere of the flight. She could feel the faint undercurrent of tension that had lingered ever since she first walked onto the plane, but she remained composed. Years of dealing with challenges far greater than this had trained her to pick her battles carefully. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain Walsh adjusted the controls, though his attention was clearly divided. His co-pilot, a younger man named Daniels, glanced at him occasionally, sensing his agitation but choosing not to comment. Walsh's demeanor had shifted since the takeoff. His usual confidence seemed tinged with irritation, his movements sharper than necessary as he adjusted dials and checked systems. Finally, Daniels broke the silence. "Everything all right, Captain?" he asked, his tone casual but probing. Walsh scoffed lightly, shaking his head. "Just one of those days. You ever get the feeling someone's trying to make a point without saying a word?" Daniels frowned slightly, not entirely sure what Walsh meant. "Not sure I follow." Walsh leaned back in his seat, his fingers drumming against the armrest. "That woman in first class. The one with the tablet. You noticed her?" Daniels nodded hesitantly. "Yeah, what about her?" Walsh smirked, though it lacked humor. "She's got that look. The kind of look that says, 'I know more than you, and I'm going to make sure you know it too.' It's a power move, Daniels. I've seen it before." Daniels didn't reply immediately. He wasn't entirely comfortable with Walsh's tone, but he also knew better than to challenge his superior directly. "Maybe she's just minding her own business," he offered diplomatically. Walsh laughed. A short, sharp sound. "You're too naive." People like her, they don't just mind their own business. They come into places like this, act like they're better than everyone else, and expect the world to bend over backwards for them. Mark my words, she's up to something. Daniels turned his attention back to the controls, wisely choosing not to engage further. Walsh, however, couldn't let it go. He was already formulating a plan, a way to reassert control over what he perceived as an affront to his authority. It wasn't about the woman herself, not entirely. It was about the principle of the thing, about maintaining the order and hierarchy that he believed defined his role as captain. In the cabin, Vanessa continued to work, seemingly oblivious to the thoughts brewing in Walsh's mind. A flight attendant approached her with a warm smile, offering a drink. Vanessa accepted politely, thanking the attendant and taking a sip of sparkling water. Her demeanor was calm, almost serene, but beneath the surface, she was already piecing together the dynamics of the situation. She had noticed Walsh's lingering glances, the barely concealed disdain in his posture, and the way his interactions with the crew carried an edge of condescension. It wasn't the first time she'd encountered someone like him, and she doubted it would be the last. About 30 minutes into the flight, the first hint of conflict arose. Walsh's voice crackled over the intercom, his tone overly formal. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I hope you're enjoying the flight so far. I'd like to remind everyone to remain seated unless absolutely necessary, as we may encounter some mild turbulence ahead. Thank you." Vanessa glanced up briefly, noting the slight shift in tone compared to his earlier announcement. There was something performative about it, as though he was speaking more for her benefit than for the rest of the passengers. She returned to her work, dismissing it as a minor annoyance. But moments later, a flight attendant approached her, her expression hesitant. "Ms. Carter," the attendant began, her voice low, "Captain Walsh has asked to speak with you. He's requested that you come to the galley." Vanessa raised an eyebrow, her interest piqued. It wasn't common for a captain to summon a passenger mid-flight, and she couldn't help but wonder what Walsh's motivations were. She set her tablet aside and stood gracefully, smoothing the front of her blouse as she followed the attendant toward the galley. The other passengers in first class glanced after her curiously, sensing the unusual nature of the interaction. When Vanessa arrived at the galley, Walsh was waiting, his arms crossed and a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. He looked her up and down briefly before speaking. "Ms. Carter, is it?" he began, his tone just barely polite. "I understand you've made quite the impression on the crew." Vanessa tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "I wasn't aware I had," she replied evenly. "Is there a problem, Captain?" Walsh chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "No problem, exactly. Just wanted to remind you that this is my aircraft. I'm responsible for the safety and comfort of everyone on board, and I'd appreciate it if you didn't create unnecessary distractions." Vanessa's eyes narrowed slightly, though her tone remained calm. "I see. And what distractions might those be?" Walsh shrugged, his smirk widening. "Let's just say I've noticed a certain energy. You seem to have a knack for commanding attention, Ms. Carter. It's not something we encourage on flights like this. Best to keep things simple and let the crew do their jobs." For a moment, there was silence as the two locked eyes. Vanessa's expression was impassive, but her mind was racing. She understood exactly what Walsh was doing, and she wasn't about to let him undermine her. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady and deliberate. "Thank you for your concern, Captain. I'll be sure to let you know if I have any questions about how to conduct myself as a passenger. In the meantime, I trust you'll focus on flying the plane." Walsh's smirk faltered ever so slightly, but he quickly recovered. "Of course," he said, his tone laced with sarcasm. Enjoy the rest of the flight." Vanessa returned to her seat, her calm exterior betraying none of the irritation she felt. Walsh's behavior was more than unprofessional, it was a challenge, a thinly veiled attempt to assert dominance in a situation where he felt threatened. But Vanessa wasn't one to back down from a challenge, especially not one as petty as this. She made a mental note to address the matter later, once the flight was over and she was back in an environment where her authority was undeniable. Back in the cockpit, Walsh couldn't shake the encounter. His irritation simmered just below the surface, manifesting in clipped instructions to the co-pilot and an overly tight grip on the controls. He didn't know what it was about Vanessa that got under his skin, but he was determined to put her in her place. For him, this wasn't just about a passenger, it was about preserving the unwritten rules that had governed his world for decades. And he wasn't about to let someone like her rewrite them. The atmosphere aboard the plane, once calm and orderly, began to shift. There was something intangible in the air, a tension that quietly crept into the interactions of the crew and passengers. Vanessa sat in her first-class seat, her expression composed but her mind sharpening. Captain Walsh's earlier confrontation lingered in her thoughts not because she was rattled, but because she could sense that it was far from over. Men like Walsh didn't back down easily, especially when their egos were involved. They escalated. And while Vanessa had hoped for an uneventful flight, she now prepared herself for what felt like an inevitable storm. Walsh, seated in the cockpit, was still fuming. His co-pilot Daniels noticed it in the way he gripped the yoke too tightly and barked curt instructions over the radio. Daniels had flown with Walsh for several months now, and while he respected the man's technical skill, he couldn't ignore his abrasive demeanor. Today, however, something was different. Walsh wasn't just annoyed, he seemed consumed by something deeper. Daniels hesitated before speaking, but the silence in the cockpit was becoming unbearable. Captain Daniels ventured cautiously, "Is everything all right? You seem tense." Walsh didn't look at him, his eyes fixed on the instrument panel, as if the dials might somehow validate his frustration. "It's fine," he snapped, then sighed heavily as if trying to rein himself in. "Passengers these days," he added after a moment, his voice tinged with disdain. "No respect for the chain of command. They think they own the place." Daniels frowned slightly but said nothing. He had a feeling he knew exactly which passenger Walsh was referring to, but he wasn't about to poke that particular hornet's nest. Instead, he focused on the flight instruments, hoping the tension would subside on its own. But Walsh wasn't done. "That woman," Walsh continued, his tone dripping with contempt. "She walks in here like she's better than everyone else. Did you see the way she talked to me? Like she owns the damn airline." Daniels shifted uncomfortably. "I'm sure she didn't mean any disrespect, Captain. Maybe it's just a misunderstanding." Walsh let out a short, bitter laugh. "Oh, it's no misunderstanding. I know her type. Thinks she's untouchable because she's sitting up there in first class. Well, I'm not going to let her disrupt my flight." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and foreboding. Daniels didn't reply. He didn't know what Walsh intended to do, but he had a sinking feeling it wasn't going to end well. Meanwhile, in the cabin, Vanessa remained outwardly calm. She had resumed reviewing documents on her tablet, her fingers moving methodically across the screen. But her attention was divided. She could feel the subtle shifts in the crew's behavior, the glances exchanged, the tension in their movements. Something was brewing, and Vanessa knew better than to ignore it. She had spent her entire career navigating power dynamics, and the signs were unmistakable. Walsh wasn't letting this go. Her instincts were confirmed when a flight attendant approached her, her expression hesitant. Vanessa looked up, her calm gaze meeting the attendant's. "Mess." "Carter," the attendant said quietly, The captain has requested that you refrain from moving about the cabin for the remainder of the flight. Vanessa raised an eyebrow, her tone even. Did he say why? The attendant looked uncomfortable, clearly caught in the middle. He just mentioned that it's for safety reasons. Vanessa studied the woman for a moment, then nodded. Thank you for letting me know. The attendant gave a small, apologetic smile before retreating. Vanessa sat back, her mind working quickly. The request was absurd. There were no safety concerns that would necessitate such a restriction, and she knew it. This wasn't about safety, it was about control. Walsh was trying to assert his authority, to remind her and likely himself who was in charge. It was petty and unprofessional, but Vanessa wasn't surprised. She had encountered men like Walsh before, and she knew how they operated. For the next hour, the tension continued to build. Walsh made several announcements over the intercom, each one carrying a barely concealed edge. He reminded passengers to remain seated, to comply with crew instructions, and to avoid unnecessary disruptions. The tone was unmistakable, and several passengers in first class began to glance at Vanessa, their curiosity piqued. She ignored them, her focus remaining on her work, but she could feel the weight of their stares. Walsh was trying to isolate her, to paint her as a problem, and it was beginning to work. Eventually, Vanessa decided it was time to act. She set her tablet aside and stood, moving purposefully toward the galley. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her as she walked, but she paid them no mind. When she reached the galley, she found the lead flight attendant speaking with another crew member. They both looked up as she approached, their expressions a mix of apprehension and curiosity. "Excuse me," Vanessa said, her tone polite but firm. "I'd like to speak with the captain." The lead attendant hesitated, glancing at her colleague before replying. "I'm not sure that's possible right now, Ms. Carter. The captain is busy." Vanessa cut her off with a calm but decisive tone. "I understand, but this won't wait. Please inform him that I'm requesting a conversation." The attendant nodded reluctantly and disappeared toward the cockpit. Vanessa waited, her posture relaxed but her mind sharp. She knew she was taking a risk by confronting Walsh directly, but she also knew it was necessary. Allowing him to continue unchecked would only embolden him further, and Vanessa had no intention of being a passive participant in whatever game he was playing. A moment later, the attendant returned, her expression uneasy. "The captain said he's unable to leave the cockpit right now, but he can speak with you through the intercom." Vanessa's lips curved into a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "That won't be necessary. I'll speak with him in person." Before the attendant could respond, Vanessa stepped past her and approached the cockpit door. She pressed the call button and waited, her patience unshaken. A few moments later, Walsh's voice came through the intercom, clipped and irritated. "This is the captain." "What is it?" Vanessa leaned toward the speaker, her voice calm but commanding. "Captain Walsh, I'd like to have a word with you regarding your recent directives. I'm concerned that they may not align with standard operating procedures." There was a pause, and when Walsh replied, his tone was laced with sarcasm. "Ms. Carter, I assure you, I'm fully capable of managing this flight. Perhaps you should return to your seat and let the crew do their jobs." Vanessa didn't flinch. "I'm confident in your technical abilities, Captain. My concern lies with your judgment. Your recent actions suggest a pattern of behavior that could compromise the professionalism of this flight." The intercom went silent for a moment, and then the cockpit door unlocked. Walsh stepped out, his expression carefully controlled but his eyes burning with barely concealed anger. He looked Vanessa up and down, his posture stiff with authority. mess. Carter, he said, his voice low but firm. I don't know what you think you're doing, but this is my plane. I make the decisions here, and I don't appreciate being questioned. Vanessa met his gaze evenly, her expression unreadable. I'm not questioning your authority, Captain. I'm questioning your behavior. There's a difference. Walsh's jaw tightened, and for a moment it looked as though he might lose his composure entirely. But instead he stepped closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper. I don't know who you think you are, but you're pushing your luck. If you don't back down, I'll have you removed from this flight at the next available opportunity. Vanessa's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, and her tone grew colder. I think you'll find that I'm not as easily removed as you might hope, Captain. I suggest you consider your next move very carefully. The two stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills, the tension between them palpable. Around them, the crew and nearby passengers watched with bated breath, sensing that something significant was unfolding. Walsh finally stepped back, his expression a mix of frustration and unease. Without another word, he turned and re-entered the cockpit, slamming the door behind him. Vanessa exhaled quietly, her composure intact. She returned to her seat, her mind already formulating the next steps. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Walsh had made it personal, and now she would have to show him just how much control he truly lacked. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane settled into its cruising altitude. Most passengers had returned to their routines. Some watched movies on the in-flight screens, others dozed off under thin airline blankets, and a few sipped drinks served by the attentive flight attendants. The hum of the engines was steady, a mechanical reminder of their forward motion through the skies. But despite the serene exterior, an invisible storm brewed behind the scenes, one that was inching closer to an eruption. Vanessa Carter, seated in first class, stared at the untouched drink on her tray. Her mind wasn't on her documents or the notes she'd meticulously prepared for her upcoming meeting. Instead, her thoughts were on the interaction with Captain Walsh. Men like him, she knew, weren't prone to sudden self-reflection or humility. His actions weren't random, they were calculated, born out of a need to reassert authority he believed was being undermined. She had seen it before in boardrooms, negotiations, and even casual interactions. Walsh's ego was wounded, and wounded egos rarely healed quietly. Vanessa had learned long ago to pick her battles, but this was different. Walsh wasn't just challenging her as a passenger, he was undermining the integrity of his role as captain. His behavior posed a risk, not just to her but to everyone on board. She leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes for a moment, her sharp mind weighing her options. Confronting him again seemed inevitable, but how she approached it would determine the outcome. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Walsh sat rigidly in his chair, his fingers drumming against the armrest. The confrontation with Vanessa replayed in his mind, each moment stoking his frustration further. He felt cornered, though he would never admit it. She had looked him in the eye, calm and unwavering, and dared to question his authority. It wasn't just disrespectful, it was a direct challenge. And worse, it had been in front of his crew. Walsh prided himself on being in control, on commanding respect without needing to demand it. But Vanessa's presence had upended that balance, exposing a vulnerability he refused to acknowledge. His co-pilot, Daniels, glanced at him cautiously. The tension in the cockpit was palpable, and Daniels had spent the last hour trying to focus on his instruments, ignoring the heavy silence that hung between them. But it was impossible to ignore Walsh's agitation, the way he shifted in his seat and muttered under his breath. "Everything all right?" Captain Daniels asked carefully, breaking the silence. Walsh shot him a sharp look, his expression a mixture of irritation and defensiveness. "I'm fine," he snapped, then softened his tone slightly. It's just, some people don't know their place. They think they can walk onto my plane and dictate how I run things. Daniels hesitated, unsure how to respond. He had a vague idea of who Walsh was talking about, but he didn't want to get involved. The dynamics of the cockpit were delicate, and the last thing he wanted was to become a target of Walsh's frustration. Instead, he nodded and turned his attention back to the controls, silently willing the flight to progress without further incident. But Walsh wasn't done. His fingers tightened around the yoke, and he leaned forward slightly, his voice low and tense. You know what happens when people like that get away with things? They think they can do whatever they want. They undermine the chain of command. That woman needs to be reminded who's in charge here. Daniels felt a chill run down his spine. The words were troubling, not just because of their content, but because of the tone in which they were delivered. Walsh sounded more like a man defending a personal grudge than a professional overseeing the safety of a flight. Daniels considered saying something, but the weight of the hierarchy silenced him. Instead, he focused on maintaining the steady course of the plane, hoping the situation would resolve itself. Back in the cabin, Vanessa noticed the lead flight attendant speaking in hushed tones with another crew member. The exchange was brief, but their body language spoke volumes. Something was happening, something Walsh likely didn't want her to know about. Vanessa's instincts, honed through years of navigating high-stakes environments, told her it was time to act. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, moving toward the galley with purposeful strides. The flight attendants looked up as she approached, their expressions a mixture of apprehension and unease. Vanessa gave them a reassuring smile, her tone calm but firm. "I'd like to speak with the captain," she said. The lead attendant hesitated, her eyes darting toward the cockpit door. "Ms. Carter, I'm not sure that's a good idea. The captain is busy at the moment." Vanessa's smile didn't waver, but her voice took on a sharper edge. "I understand your position, but this is important. Please let him know I'm requesting a conversation." The attendant hesitated for a moment longer, then nodded reluctantly. She disappeared into the cockpit, leaving Vanessa standing in the galley. The other attendants avoided her gaze, their discomfort evident. Vanessa understood their position. They were caught in the middle, unwilling participants in a power struggle they hadn't signed up for. But she couldn't let their discomfort deter her. There was too much at stake. The attendant returned a few moments later, her expression apologetic. "The captain says he's unavailable at the moment," she said. "He suggests you return to your seat." Vanessa's eyes narrowed slightly, though her tone remained calm. "I see. Thank you for relaying the message." She returned to her seat, her mind racing. Walsh's refusal to engage wasn't a surprise, but it was a confirmation of his mindset. He wasn't interested in resolving the situation, he was interested in winning. And that made him dangerous. Vanessa reached for her tablet, pulling up a secure communication app she rarely used. It connected directly to her corporate team on the ground, bypassing traditional channels. If Walsh wanted to escalate, she would meet him on her terms. The message she sent was brief and to the point, outlining the situation and requesting immediate intervention. Her team responded within minutes, their efficiency a testament to the system she had put in place. Vanessa read their reply carefully, then set the tablet aside, her confidence bolstered. She had initiated a protocol designed for situations just like this, rare, but not unheard of. The next steps were already in motion, and Walsh was about to learn just how little control he truly had. In the cockpit, Walsh noticed a message flash on one of the flight systems, a notification that shouldn't have been there. He frowned, leaning forward to examine it more closely. It was a communication from ground control, but the tone was unusual. The message outlined a request for an updated flight plan, citing passenger concerns. Walsh's irritation flared, and he muttered under his breath, his hands tightening on the controls. "Daniels," he barked, "get me ground control. I want to know what the hell this is about." Daniels complied, opening the communication channel and relaying Walsh's question. The response came back quickly, but it wasn't what Walsh wanted to hear. Ground control confirmed that the request was legitimate, initiated by a passenger with authorized access. Walsh's face darkened, his jaw tightening as he processed the implications. He knew exactly who was behind it. "That woman," he muttered, his voice low and seething. "She thinks she can hijack my flight from the ground." Daniels looked at him, his expression uneasy. "Captain, if ground control is involved, maybe we should." "I don't need you second-guessing me," Daniels Walsh snapped. "I'm the captain, and I make the decisions here." Daniels fell silent, though his unease only grew. Walsh's fixation on Vanessa was becoming increasingly irrational, and Daniels could see the cracks forming in his composure. He began to wonder if he should escalate the situation himself, but the chain of command held him back. For now, he focused on his duties, hoping the flight would reach its destination without further incident. Vanessa, meanwhile, remained calm. She knew the steps were in motion, and all she had to do now was wait. Her actions weren't about ego or proving a point, they were about ensuring the integrity of the flight and the safety of its passengers. Walsh's behavior had crossed a line, and she wasn't going to let him jeopardize the trust her airline had worked so hard to build. The tension continued to build, an invisible storm brewing just beneath the surface. Passengers began to notice the subtle shifts in the crew's behavior, the quiet urgency in their movements. The hum of the engines seemed louder somehow, a backdrop to the unspoken conflict that was unfolding. And as the plane hurtled through the skies, Vanessa prepared herself for the next move, knowing that the battle was far from over. The cabin was no longer filled with the gentle hum of routine that defined most flights. The passengers, though still seated and relatively quiet, were growing restless. Some exchanged glances, sensing that something wasn't right. The flight attendants moved with an urgency that wasn't characteristic of their usual calm demeanor, their smiles now strained. Vanessa Carter could feel the growing tension around her, as palpable as the steady vibration of the engines. She remained composed, her expression betraying none of the calculations running through her mind. She had pushed the system into motion, knowing that Walsh would escalate in response. What she hadn't anticipated was just how far he might go to reassert control. In the cockpit, Walsh's temper boiled over as another message from ground control came through. This time, it was a direct order to provide clarification on the revised flight plan submitted under Vanessa's authority. Walsh gritted his teeth, his hands gripping the yoke as if by sheer force he could prevent the unraveling of his command. His co-pilot Daniels sat uneasily beside him, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. Daniels had seen tension on flights before, but this was different. Walsh wasn't just annoyed, he was furious, and that fury was clouding his judgment. "This is getting out of hand," Walsh muttered, his voice low but seething with frustration. He turned to Daniels, his eyes flashing with barely contained anger. "She's making a mockery of my authority. I've had enough of this." Daniels shifted in his seat, his discomfort evident. "Captain, maybe we should comply with ground control's request. It seems legitimate." Walsh slammed a hand on the console, causing Daniels to flinch. "Don't you dare start siding with her," Walsh spat. "This is my flight, and I'm not going to let some entitled passenger dictate how I run it. Do you understand?" Daniels nodded quickly, his instinct for self-preservation overriding any lingering doubts. But as Walsh turned back to the controls, Daniels couldn't shake the growing unease in his chest. He had seen captains lose their temper before, but this was different. Walsh wasn't just angry, he was unraveling. Back in the cabin, Vanessa continued to observe, her gaze sharp and unwavering. She had already alerted her corporate team about Walsh's behavior, triggering an internal investigation that would begin as soon as they landed. But landing seemed farther away than ever. The situation was spiraling, and Walsh's resistance to authority only made her more determined to see this through. She had encountered men like him before, men who mistook their positions of power for personal dominion. She knew how dangerous they could be when cornered. The lead flight attendant approached her again, her expression more anxious this time. "Ms. Carter," she began, her voice low, "the captain has requested that you refrain from communicating with ground control for the remainder of the flight." Vanessa looked up, her gaze steady. "Requested or demanded?" she asked. The attendant hesitated. "He made it clear that he considers your actions disruptive to the operation of the flight." Vanessa nodded slowly, her mind already working. "Thank you for letting me know," she said, her tone calm. The attendant lingered for a moment, as if she wanted to say more, but then thought better of it and retreated. Vanessa knew the crew was caught in the crossfire, unwilling participants in a battle they didn't sign up for. But their loyalty to Walsh was wavering. She could see it in their eyes, hear it in their hesitant responses. They were beginning to question whether their captain truly had control. Walsh's next move came quickly. The intercom crackled, and his voice filled the cabin, its usual professional polish replaced by a hard edge. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. For the safety and comfort of all passengers, I must remind you to follow all instructions given by the crew. Disruptive behavior will not be tolerated, and any actions that interfere with the operation of this flight will be dealt with accordingly. Thank you for your cooperation." The words hung in the air like a warning bell, their implications clear. Vanessa felt the eyes of other passengers on her, their curiosity now mixed with unease. Some whispered to one another, trying to piece together what was happening. She remained still, her expression composed, but inside she knew Walsh was inching closer to a breaking point. Minutes later, the plane jolted slightly, a brief but noticeable turbulence shaking the cabin. Walsh used the moment to his advantage. The intercom buzzed again, and his voice returned, sharper this time. "We've encountered some turbulence ahead. I ask all passengers to remain seated with their seatbelts fastened until further notice." The turbulence was minor, and Vanessa suspected it wasn't enough to warrant such a stern directive. Walsh was using it as an excuse to tighten his control, to limit movement in the cabin, and reassert his authority. She glanced at the flight attendants, who exchanged uneasy glances but complied with the order. Vanessa buckled her seatbelt, her mind racing through the possibilities. Walsh was playing a dangerous game, one that could easily spiral out of control if not checked. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden arrival of the lead flight attendant, who leaned in close to whisper, "Ms. Carter, the captain has requested to speak with you privately. He's waiting in the galley." Vanessa raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. Walsh's decision to summon her was unexpected, but she wasn't surprised. He was likely trying to confront her directly, to intimidate her into backing down. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, her movements deliberate and measured. "Lead the way," she said. The galley was empty when they arrived, save for Walsh, who stood with his arms crossed and a look of barely contained anger on his face. Vanessa stepped forward, her posture relaxed but her gaze unwavering. The flight attendant hesitated at the edge of the galley, clearly unsure whether to stay or leave. "It's all right," Vanessa said, her voice calm. I'm sure the captain and I can handle this." The attendant nodded and retreated, leaving the two of them alone. Walsh didn't waste any time. "MS. Carter," he began, his tone cold and clipped. "I've had enough of your interference. This is my flight, and I won't have you undermining my authority." Vanessa met his gaze, her expression neutral. "Undermining your authority, Captain, or holding you accountable for your actions?" Walsh's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. "You've crossed a line. Communicating with ground control without my authorization is a violation of protocol. And neglecting your responsibility to maintain a professional environment aboard this flight is a violation of your role as Captain," Vanessa countered, her tone steady but firm. "I acted within my rights and within the authority granted to me by this airline." Walsh took a step closer, his voice lowering to a near growl. "You think you're untouchable, don't you? You think you can walk onto my plane and throw your weight around because you bought a first-class ticket? Well, let me tell you something, MS Carter. This is my domain. Up here, I make the rules." Vanessa didn't flinch. She held his gaze, her voice calm but edged with steel. "No, Captain. Up here, safety and professionalism make the rules. And your actions have called both into question." The tension between them was electric, the air thick with unspoken challenges. Walsh's face darkened, his composure slipping further with each passing second. "You've been nothing but a disruption from the moment you stepped on board," he snapped. "If you don't stop interfering, I will have you restrained for the remainder of the flight." Vanessa's expression didn't change, but her eyes hardened. "I suggest you think very carefully before making that decision, Captain. Because once we land, there will be consequences for every action you've taken, including this conversation." Walsh stared at her, his breathing heavy, his anger palpable. But before he could respond, a sudden knock at the galley door interrupted them. It was the lead flight attendant, her face pale. "Captain, there's been a message from ground control. They're requesting an immediate update on the situation." Walsh turned to her, his face a mask of barely contained rage. "Tell them everything is under control." The attendant hesitated, then nodded and disappeared. Walsh turned back to Vanessa, his expression livid. "You think you've won, don't you?" Vanessa tilted her head slightly, her tone calm but cutting. "This isn't about winning, Captain. It's about doing what's right, something you seem to have forgotten." With that, she turned and walked back to her seat, leaving Walsh standing alone in the galley, his anger burning like a storm waiting to break. The tension in the cabin had reached a breaking point, palpable even to the most oblivious passengers. While most remained in their seats, quietly exchanging nervous glances or murmuring to one another, the atmosphere was no longer that of a routine flight. Something was clearly wrong, though few could pinpoint exactly what. The hum of the engines, the soft glow of the cabin lights, and the distant clinking of drink glasses were the only sounds that masked the uneasy silence. Vanessa Carter sat upright in her seat, her posture radiating composure even as her mind calculated the next steps. She was no stranger to situations like this, though they were rare. It wasn't the first time she had faced someone like Walsh, a man whose pride blinded him to reason. But what made this different was the stakes. This wasn't just a clash of egos or a professional dispute. This was a matter of safety, professionalism, and the reputation of her airline. Walsh had crossed a line, and Vanessa knew she had to ensure he didn't go any further. In the cockpit, Captain Walsh was barely keeping his composure intact. The messages from ground control had become increasingly pointed, demanding an explanation for the irregularities in communication and the apparent disruption on board. Walsh's hands gripped the yoke tightly, his knuckles white with tension. His co-pilot Daniels sat stiffly beside him, his unease growing with every passing moment. Daniels had tried to stay out of the conflict, but it was becoming clear that Walsh's anger was clouding his judgment. Another message flashed across the cockpit display, this one marked as urgent. Walsh scowled as he read it, his frustration boiling over. Ground control was now requesting a direct update from him regarding the incident. They had been informed of a passenger-initiated protocol, and Walsh could only guess who was behind it. He slammed a fist against the console, causing Daniels to flinch. "This is ridiculous," Walsh muttered, his voice low and venomous. "They're trying to take control of my flight." Daniels hesitated, then spoke cautiously. "Captain, maybe we should just respond. It might help de-escalate the situation." Walsh turned to him, his expression furious. "De-escalate? You think I'm the one escalating this? That woman has been undermining me from the start, and now she's got ground control breathing down my neck. I'm not going to let her take over my flight." Daniels swallowed hard, deciding it was safer to remain silent. But internally his concern grew. Walsh's fixation on Vanessa had gone beyond professional frustration. It was personal, and that made it dangerous. Back in the cabin, Vanessa noticed the lead flight attendant approaching her again, her expression strained. Vanessa set her tablet aside and looked up, her gaze calm but questioning. "MS. Carter," the attendant began, her voice low. "Ground control has requested an immediate response to the situation. They've also informed us that they're monitoring the flight closely." Vanessa nodded. "And the captain?" The attendant hesitated, then leaned in slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's not cooperating. He's refusing to follow their instructions." Vanessa's eyes narrowed slightly, her mind racing. She had anticipated resistance from Walsh, but his outright refusal to comply with ground control was a new level of defiance. It wasn't just unprofessional, it was reckless. She took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. "Thank you for letting me know," Vanessa said, her tone steady. "I'll handle it from here." The attendant looked relieved, though still uneasy, as she nodded and stepped away. Vanessa reached for her tablet, pulling up the secure communication app once more. She typed quickly, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency. The message she sent was direct and unambiguous, outlining the escalating situation and her recommendation for immediate intervention. Within moments, she received a reply, the details of which she read carefully before setting the tablet aside. She stood and walked toward the galley, her steps purposeful. The passengers watched her go, their curiosity and concern evident. Vanessa ignored their stares, her focus entirely on the task at hand. She had no intention of letting Walsh jeopardize the safety of this flight any further. When she reached the galley, she pressed the call button for the cockpit. A moment later, Walsh's voice crackled through the intercom, his tone sharp and irritated. "What is it now?" he demanded. Vanessa's response was calm but firm. "Captain Walsh, ground control has informed me of your refusal to comply with their directives. I strongly suggest you reconsider your position." There was a brief pause before Walsh replied, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I don't take orders from passengers, MS. Carter, return to your seat and let me do my job." Vanessa didn't flinch. "Your job, Captain, is to ensure the safety and professionalism of this flight. Your behavior has compromised both." The intercom went silent, and for a moment, Vanessa wondered if Walsh would simply ignore her. But then the cockpit door unlocked, and Walsh stepped out, his expression livid. He closed the door behind him and stood in the narrow galley, his posture stiff with anger. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Walsh said, his voice low but furious. "I've been flying planes longer than you've probably been alive. I don't need some self-important passenger telling me how to do my job." Vanessa met his gaze evenly, her expression unreadable. This isn't about your experience, Captain. It's about your judgment. And right now, your judgment is putting everyone on this plane at risk. Walsh's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. You think you're so smart, don't you? You think you can just waltz onto my plane and take over? Well, let me tell you something, MS Carter. This is my domain. Up here, I'm in charge. Vanessa's voice remained calm, but her words cut like steel. Not anymore, Captain. Walsh's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might lose control entirely. But before he could respond, the intercom crackled, and a voice from ground control filled the cabin. This is ground control to Captain Walsh. You are ordered to comply with all directives immediately. Failure to do so will result in further action. The words hung in the air like a hammer blow. Walsh's face darkened, his anger giving way to a flicker of uncertainty. He turned back to Vanessa, his expression a mixture of fury and disbelief. You think you've won, he spat. Vanessa tilted her head slightly, her tone measured. This was never about winning, Captain. It was about doing what's right. Walsh stared at her for a moment longer, then turned and stormed back into the cockpit. Vanessa remained in the galley, her composure unshaken. She knew the situation wasn't over yet, but she also knew that ground control was now fully involved. The system was in motion, and Walsh's defiance would no longer go unchecked. As she returned to her seat, the passengers watched her with a mix of curiosity and admiration. Vanessa ignored their stares, her focus already shifting to the next steps. She had done her part to contain the situation, but the real resolution would come once they landed. In the cockpit, Walsh sat in seething silence, his hands gripping the controls tightly. Daniels glanced at him nervously, unsure whether to speak. The tension was suffocating, and Daniels could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Finally, Walsh let out a heavy sigh, his voice low and bitter. Fine. Let them have their way. But this isn't over. Daniels said nothing, his relief tempered by the knowledge that the flight was far from its conclusion. For now, he focused on the instruments, silently willing the plane toward its destination. In the cabin, Vanessa sat quietly, her mind already working through the details of what would come next. Walsh's behavior had been reckless and unprofessional, and there would be consequences. But for now, her priority was ensuring that everyone on board arrived safely. As the plane continued its journey, she prepared herself for the final confrontation, knowing that the real battle was still ahead. The plane began its descent, and the cabin filled with the faint hum of renewed activity. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, checking seatbelts and securing loose items, their expressions still tense but determined to maintain a semblance of normalcy. Passengers adjusted their seats, some gazing out of the windows as the city below came into view, while others exchanged whispers, their unease bubbling beneath the surface. Vanessa Carter remained seated, her expression composed as always, but her mind was sharp and focused. The events of the flight had set a precedent she couldn't ignore, and the moment the plane touched down, the full weight of what had transpired would come crashing down on Captain Walsh. Walsh sat in the cockpit, his face a mask of stubborn anger. The silence between him and Daniels was deafening, broken only by the occasional communication from ground control. Each message was a reminder of his defiance, a cold reality that his authority had been challenged and effectively overridden. His hands gripped the yoke tightly, as if holding onto the controls could somehow preserve the last shreds of his dominance. He refused to acknowledge the consequences waiting for him on the ground, pushing the thought aside with sheer force of will. Final approach, Walsh muttered, his voice clipped. Daniels nodded, his relief palpable. The younger pilot had spent the last hour navigating a minefield of tension, his instincts screaming at him to keep his head down and focus on the technical aspects of the flight. But even Daniels couldn't deny the growing certainty that this was the last time he would fly alongside Walsh. As the plane descended further, Vanessa glanced at her tablet, confirming the messages she'd received from her corporate team. Everything was in place. The protocol she had initiated was no longer just about ensuring safety, it had set off a chain of events that would resonate far beyond this flight. Vanessa knew that the resolution of this incident wasn't just about Walsh's behavior, it was about accountability, about sending a message to anyone who thought they could operate above the principles her airline stood for. The wheels touched down smoothly, and the plane taxied toward the gate. The passengers stirred, some reaching for their belongings, others glancing around with visible relief. The routine motions of disembarkation provided a temporary sense of normalcy, but Vanessa could feel the underlying tension still simmering. She unbuckled her seatbelt but remained seated, her posture calm as she waited for what she knew was coming next. The moment the plane came to a complete stop, Walsh's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. On behalf of the crew, I'd like to thank you for flying with us. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off." There was a faint edge to his voice, a bitterness that didn't escape Vanessa's notice. She waited as the passengers began to disembark, their movements slow and deliberate, a reflection of the unease that had lingered throughout the flight. Vanessa stayed in her seat, her focus shifting to the flight attendants, who exchanged quiet glances before one of them approached her. "Ms. Carter," the lead attendant said softly, "the ground team is here. They've requested that you remain on board for a moment." Vanessa nodded, her expression giving nothing away. "Thank you." As the last of the passengers exited the plane, a team of corporate representatives and security personnel stepped onto the aircraft. They moved with quiet authority, their presence a stark contrast to the tension that had defined the flight. The lead representative, a tall man with a sharp suit and an air of quiet professionalism, approached Vanessa, extending a hand. "Ms. Carter," he said, his tone respectful. "Thank you for your patience. We're here to address the situation." Vanessa shook his hand, her grip firm. "I trust you've been fully briefed." He nodded. "Yes, ma'am. We've reviewed the communications and the protocol you initiated. Everything is in place." Vanessa stood, her movements measured. "Then let's proceed." The group made their way toward the cockpit, where Walsh and Daniels remained seated. Walsh stiffened as he saw them approach, his eyes narrowing. He knew who they were, and their presence confirmed his worst fears. Still, he clung to the remnants of his authority, refusing to back down. "What's the meaning of this?" Walsh demanded, his voice sharp. The lead representative stepped forward, his expression neutral but firm. "Captain Walsh, we're here to address the events of this flight. You've been instructed to cooperate fully with ground control and the corporate team. Any further resistance will have serious consequences." Walsh's jaw tightened, his anger simmering just below the surface. "I've done nothing wrong. This is my flight, and I've followed protocol to the letter." Vanessa stepped forward, her gaze locked on Walsh. "Your behavior has been anything but professional, Captain. You've jeopardized the integrity of this flight and undermined the trust that passengers place in us. That ends now." Walsh turned to her, his face flushed with anger. "You think you can waltz in here and dictate how I run my plane? You're nothing but a..." "Enough," Vanessa said, her voice cold and unyielding. "This isn't your plane, Captain, it's mine. And your actions have made it clear that you no longer have a place here." The words hit like a hammer, and for a moment, Walsh was speechless. The weight of Vanessa's authority finally broke through his defiance, leaving him reeling. He looked at the corporate representatives, then at Daniels, who avoided his gaze. Finally, he turned back to Vanessa, his expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. "You can't do this," Walsh said, though his voice lacked conviction. Vanessa's gaze didn't waver. "I already have." With a nod from the lead representative, the security personnel stepped forward. Walsh stiffened as they escorted him from the cockpit, his protests falling on deaf ears. Daniels watched silently, his relief mixed with apprehension. The removal of Walsh marked the end of an era one defined by unchecked authority and the arrogance it bred. As the group moved to disembark, Vanessa took a moment to address the flight attendants, who stood nearby, their expressions a mixture of uncertainty and hope. "Thank you for your professionalism," Vanessa said, her tone sincere. "Your dedication to the passengers and the integrity of this flight did not go unnoticed." The attendants exchanged glances, their posture relaxing slightly. Vanessa's words carried weight, and they knew she meant every one of them. With that, she exited the plane, her steps steady and confident. Outside, a small group of reporters had gathered, their cameras trained on the scene. Vanessa ignored them, her focus on the corporate team waiting nearby. She approached them, her expression calm but resolute. "Let's ensure this is handled properly," she said. "I want a full review of every detail. This isn't just about one flight, it's about the standards we uphold." The team nodded, their respect for her evident. Vanessa didn't wait for further discussion. She moved toward a waiting car, her mind already on the steps ahead. Walsh's behavior had exposed weaknesses in the system, and she was determined to address them. This wasn't just about consequences, it was about ensuring that such a situation could never happen again. As the car pulled away, Vanessa allowed herself a moment of reflection. The flight had tested her in ways she hadn't anticipated, but it had also reaffirmed her belief in the importance of accountability. Leadership wasn't about power, it was about responsibility. And Vanessa had no intention of shirking hers.